Hi, good morning, good afternoon, and perhaps even good evening by the looks of some of the folks on the list. We see a lot of familiar names, and we're very excited that you could join us. My name is Doug Lamb with McGuireWoods. I'm a lawyer in our Richmond, Virginia office. I am joined for this presentation on renewable natural gas and project development by my colleague, John Lane, as well as two individuals from Smithfield Foods, Craig Westerbeek and Stuart Leaf. Craig is a senior director of Smithfield Renewables, and Stuart is the chief sustainability officer with Smithfield Foods. In a second, I'm going to hand it to them to give some brief background on each of themselves, and then for Stuart to hand it back to John, who is going to run through a brief presentation before we open up to a roundtable discussion and welcome your questions as we proceed. You'll be able to type your questions and submit them to us, and we will also try to continue this conversation. Please feel free at any point and to submit them. And at this point, I'm going to hand it to you, Craig, and if you would hand it to Stuart and Stuart back to John, and we'll get rolling. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining.
Hello, this is Craig Westerbeek. I'm a senior director of Smithfield Renewables, business platform that was created to accelerate Smithfield's carbon reduction, achieving Smithfield's carbon reduction goals. Part of that is our biogas projects, which we have really accelerated over the last several years, have several really successful projects on the ground, have been producing renewable natural gas for several years. So I look forward to talking about that today and appreciate the opportunity. Stuart?
Thank you, Craig and Doug. I am Stuart Leaf. I'm the Chief Sustainability Officer for Smithfield Foods, and my responsibilities include oversight of our environmental regulatory compliance programs, including beyond compliance programs such as Smithfield Renewables and many of the other efforts that we're achieving under the various pillars of our sustainability platform, and renewables and our greenhouse gas programs that we're going to talk about today is front and center for that. So I'm happy to be here, and I guess I'm supposed to turn it to you, John.
All right, thanks, Stuart. My name is John Lane. I'm in the environmental group at McGuireWoods, and what I want to do first is start with just a really quick overview of the low carbon fuel standard and the renewable fuel standard, which in each case produces the monetization that makes these renewable natural gas projects attractive for people. And so we'll start with a low carbon fuel standard, which is a program that's administered by the California Air Resources Board that governs transportation fuel in California. It was created initially in 2009 and has been amended a few times, most recently in 2018. But in essence, what it does is it sets a carbon intensity benchmark for certain transportation fuels that are used in California, imported, distributed, and used in California, sold in California. And if your fuel is above that benchmark and you're a regulated party, then you're supposed to make up for that by buying credits, and the credits are generated by transportation fuels made by things such as renewable natural gas that have a carbon intensity lower than the benchmark. And the difference then is the amount of credits that you have available to sell. The carbon intensity is kind of measured after a life cycle analysis that when you have a project, you give them the pathway, present a life cycle analysis, and have a carbon intensity and number assigned to your fuel. And that's what allows you, once you've created your biogas, have a contractual arrangement, and biogas can be generated in North Carolina, for instance, and as long as you have a contractual arrangement and the ability to put your gas into a interstate pipeline, then due to the fungibility of gas molecules, someone can take gas out of a pipeline in California, use it to fuel vehicles, and thus that fuel created in North Carolina can create a low carbon fuel standard credit in California. For the renewable fuel standard, that's the one that I think most people associate initially with ethanol, corn ethanol. It was established in the Energy Policy Act 2005, set it up initially, and the renewable fuel standard sets annual requirements for renewable fuels each year up to 2022. And later on in the program, we'll talk about what happens after 22. But and the target they set is called the renewable volume obligations. And certain parties are responsible for meeting those renewable volume obligations, and those are the obligated parties, which are oil refineries, primarily gasoline and diesel fuel importers. And the way you show your the way an obligated party shows that it's complying with the renewable fuel standard requirements is through renewable identification numbers, which is how they track renewable fuels. And so renewable identification numbers are known as RINs. And when you create a gallon, for instance, of renewable fuel, then that creates a RIN, as long as then later on it is going to be used for fuel purposes. And so the fuel is generated, it's sold for fuel purposes. You list that transaction and the generation into an EPA tracking system, which has been set up, called the EMTS system. And those RINs are then available for sale for people who need to buy them because they haven't met their obligated party responsibilities. There's a special type of RIN called a Q-RIN, which has been audited and verified, and it's trades at a slight premium to regular RINs. I think so. Most of the RIN transfers, and I'll be curious, Greg and Stuart, as to how you all treat that. But most RINs are not Q-RINs that are sold in the market. Most RINs are still just regular renewable identification numbers. And one of the keys is kind of like the creating the gas in North Carolina and transferring it for use in California. RINs can be sold with the gas that they're produced with, or can be unbundled and sold separately. So the same process occurs where you can create gas in one state, separate the RINs, and we'll talk about how that's done through the sale of environmental attributes, and you sell those separately, sell the gas separately, and then later a person can buy a RIN, attach it to a gas that's not been renewable gas, but essentially creating green gas out of what had been brown gas before you attach a RIN to it. And so that's the sort of nuts and bolts of those systems. And Craig, Doug, and Stuart, you can feel free to chime in on any other pieces of it. But those two things, the low carbon fuel standard and the renewable identification numbers, are the marketable items that you end up producing from a renewable natural gas project, along with the gas itself.
Yeah, John, the only thing I would add to that, this is Stuart, and I know Craig can talk to this easily as well, but the only other thing I would say is the voluntary markets are there as well. Many utilities and manufacturers, universities, are buying these products now to help them with their own commitments, to greenhouse gas reductions and carbon neutrality. So maybe not tied to a RIN value or to a LCF score, but there's a whole different market there as well in the voluntary markets.
That's a good point, Stuart. That you're right. I was focusing on the government regulatory side, but there is, just like with renewable energy, generally there are some voluntary market participants who are willing to pay a premium for sustainable gas. Yep. And with that, I guess we'll turn it back into what we'd like to do now is just sort of have a roundtable discussion and talk about our experiences with RNG projects and some of the key components. Give everyone a flavor of what it takes to do one and what some of the key issues are. I think that to start, Greg, I'll just ask you, since Smithfield has been at this for a while, what's the biggest change you've seen in the renewable natural gas market since you guys got into this several years ago?
I think Stuart alluded to it, but clearly the market's interest in renewable natural gas is probably the biggest difference over the last several years. When we first started some of our projects, we were making decisions on projects based on a marginal spot market. And now that you have more visibility into that market, whether it's Lcfs or RIN market, more confidence in the market, we found that many more opportunities exist, and the number of viable projects has increased for us. I think the other, it's not necessarily in the market space, which I think your question was about, but I also think we understand how to execute much better with regards to not only producing biogas, cleaning biogas, but also into RNG, but also getting it into the markets in a manner in which the market requires.
Yeah, this is Stuart, John. Let me echo that, and I mean, it seems like for us, and we've been at this for, Craig, a couple decades, right? I mean, you and I, and going back a long time, and McGuireWoods has helped us out over the years as well on different things. But these projects have fundamentally changed. I mean, from where they were even a decade ago, and their focus on, a project that would create methane, harvesting methane on a farm, where it would feed a genset, microturbines, and then feed a grid through a power purchase agreement of some kind. And you all helped us with manure supply agreements where we were providing the supply of manure, but little else, ground leases and space and whatnot to operate. We had no interest in capital outlays for these things. But it's, as Craig said, the market has changed, and our whole outlook has changed to a different formula to produce RNG on a larger scale, using kind of the size and scale of our company and our joint venture partners' company to bring RNG to market on a larger scale to take advantage of the markets you just described.
Yeah, I'd agree, Stuart.
And Stuart, would you say that the original, y'all have been at it for a while now. This is Doug Lamb. Your original business rationale, has it evolved over time, or has it stayed the same given the market changes? Have you been able to, your business objectives been able to evolve with the evolution of those markets?
Yeah, so I mean, the business case for these things has evolved a bit, but I mean, our sustainability platform, includes not just environmental, but other things like worker safety, animal care, and we have, and it's kind of characterized kind of by big, bold targets, and where the path may not be entirely clear, but the one thing that's kind of consistent is that we have to show some business case for what we're going to do and what we plan to do, and that has changed a bit. I mean, it's so it could be cost savings, it could be risk management. The best of all worlds is a revenue generation, and so when Craig and I were working and we're selling our was better way to say it, our greenhouse gas goal to our senior management. And those types of things. I mean, there are several business case scenarios that we were able to show. Number one, progress to our goal, greenhouse gas reductions across our value chain. But as we go forward, we're seeing actual revenue generation from these projects, which are things that we didn't really visualize 10 years ago, if fully. I don't think. I mean, you agree with that, Craig? I mean, it seemed to me that the market has really come to us with this and has really improved the business case for it beyond what was there before.
No, I would agree. I would agree with that. And clearly, the markets allow us to complete more projects, and and it's been good for the projects with regards to selling the projects beyond the other benefits we see as a company in doing these type projects.
Yeah, I mean, it seemed like, as an example, and we have large farms in Missouri, and Doug, John, you guys will remember these places, but some of the business advantages of our projects there initially were we were avoiding capital expenditure on barns, things that we had to do in the barns. We were having covers that the renewable energy company was going to put on lagoons, and we had the benefit of better manure management, where we had to eliminate the having to manage stormwater, rainwater as part of the manure system. There are many other benefits, and all that's just true with these things. But the best thing of all is that they're able to generate revenue.
So in those cases where you're working with third parties, what do you find, Craig or Stuart, to be critical to success with the third party? If it's a developer on your farm in those scenarios, all the way up to now where the joint venture that y'all have formed, what have y'all found to be critical in those different models?
We've got a couple joint ventures, one with Dominion Energy, who's a great partner. They have a long history of being in the natural gas and electricity business. They understand that business and the markets very well. We're in the hog raising business, and we produce food. That's what we do. We understand manure management very well. We understand how to do these projects very well. We have the relationships with farmers. What we didn't necessarily have, or I guess we're learning as we go, but is some of the expertise in areas like Dominion has, as an example. And so that partnership has been fantastic, hopefully, for both parties. We have a similar joint venture with a technology company out in northern Missouri. All three parties get along very well. They have done a lot in the area of gas upgrading system design and so forth, and kind of modularizing that and improving the efficiency of that process. They're also big EPCs. They're also a big EPC firm as well as a equipment manufacturer. And so, those type partnerships, we have looked to those to leverage what could be our weaknesses, and partner with folks that add expertise in areas that we don't have expertise. And I think that's really helped us accelerate our movement to more of these projects.
So, go ahead.
I was going to say, Doug, I think, Craig, one thing you'd mentioned some before too is some of the keys of making the project successful are working with, when you're not doing your own farms, but working with third parties, are describing sort of how you give a stake for the person, if it's not you managing the manure, how you make sure someone is interested and invested in the success of the project.
Yeah, I think anybody that's contemplating RNG projects now understand that Smithfield, our projects are singularly with swine manure. We don't have mixed digesters. Our digester design and all of our systems designed around manure, which is not swine manure, which is not the highest producer of gas, but we know a lot about it. We know what we feed the animals. We know what the energy content is going in and coming out for all the different types of animals, and so that's something that simplifies that process for us. But anytime, the way we view this business is you got to be fair for everyone. The farmer is not going to participate. The farmer, at the end of the day, owns the manure. Now, we've done projects in Utah and Missouri and other places where we own the farms, and we do own farms, but we don't own nearly all the farms that we do business with. Most of our production across the United States, the majority actually is through partnerships with family farmers of various sizes. And so, including them in these projects becomes something that they have to have some sort of return on investment we're not requiring anybody that grows our animals to participate in these projects, but what we're trying to do is create the infrastructure in different areas, whether it's in North Carolina or wherever it might be, so that they can participate. We think the best model is that they own an investment. In the case of our model, they would own a digester and build a digester per our specifications, and they would get paid for the biogas that they produce, on a attractive return on investment. At the end of the day, no manure to energy project is going to work if the manure doesn't get into a digester in a fresh form, because it'll off gas and you'll lose most of the methane that you're trying to harvest. And so that day-to-day responsibility is always going to be with the farmer. And so the farmer has to be an integral partner and sharing the return on investment if you're going to have a successful project, whether that's one of our farms that we own or contract growers or non-contract growers. Anybody that's in that area of project development has an opportunity to participate.
And that, just for perspective, so folks who aren't familiar with our company, Craig's exactly right. And that's what's a great thing about this, is it provides another income stream diversification for family farmers, which is the bulk of, we're a vertically integrated company where we own a lot of farms and we own a lot of animals, but the vast majority of livestock and live animals come from farms that are run and been owned by families and family companies for a long time. So it takes us away from just being some big company making more money on something. We're sharing in that revenue with a lot of folks who can diversify their farms, which is the name of the game in agriculture.
And Craig and Stuart or John, in terms of the different models over time y'all have seen of sponsors, owners doing their own projects and developing them, or in contracting with third parties versus, y'all reference bringing third parties in early on. Can you talk about some of the things you've seen there? Whether it's third parties trying to get their own financing, the issues you've seen there, and we can address that as well, John and I can, but also in terms of the ease of execution when it's not a third-party finance transaction, and address some of that, if you would.
For me, in the context of planning for a project and how do you plan for them, you've got to understand your interconnect options. You've got to understand, in our case, of using swine manure density, farm density, and type, and truly understand what that means and what that means in terms of biogas production. And understand, when you do that, you can understand kind of the baseline underlying economics to develop accurate performers. And that comes with experience. I've never seen a performer that didn't work on paper, but, at the end of the day, understanding what your biogas production per head of finishing space, for instance, is going to be in a given region, given the diet that you're feeding, et cetera, your digester design, all that is just super critical to having a project that's going to work. And when you look at that and say, what are the key aspects and provisions of the process for someone, a manure supply agreement is a huge part of that. Having relationships with farmers that's co-beneficial, that is key, and that trust with farmers has to develop over time and has to be consistent. In our situation, where we are connecting a lot of farms to form kind of a cluster of farms for a gas upgrading system, easement agreements, working with using local knowledge, if you have it, for compensation, is key as well. So, those are the things I would throw out. Stuart, John, please add on.
Yeah, I would say, in terms of lender requirements, Doug, John, you all probably have a better sense of the scope of those things. We have been operating with our joint venture partner with Dominion, where we don't have to deal with some of those things. I know that we've we've worked together on some of these projects early on, where lenders had different requirements in order to enter the fray and provide some lending to some of our partners early on, and required us to kind of renegotiate a few things or consider renegotiating a few things. But we haven't had as much probably of a interaction with lending requirements as you guys have.
Yeah, and I'll ask you, Doug, who's financed many of these, and outside, as Stuart says, and Craig say, they have the luxury at least of not having to deal too much with lenders, particularly now as the business has evolved. But from your point of view, what are some of the biggest problems, or I shouldn't say problems, but what's unique, or what are some of the obstacles with getting financing for RNG projects?
Well, to getting the financing, I guess, is one item, and then obviously I think Craig nailed it when he mentioned the sort of, or was alluding to the proving out of a pro forma over time after you get financing. Particularly, obviously there are tons of different models of doing these projects and different ways of bringing capital in, but in those sort of special purpose entity transactions, it really I think the biggest obstacles to getting financing are likely ensuring you have those agreements that Craig mentioned that support the transaction, and that could be anything from the interconnects or the easement agreements or the feedstock agreements, but are they done in a way that with parties that have sufficient creditworthiness? That's one of the biggest things. And likely that plays into that is the experience of the developer in the space. A lot of times you find folks that just don't have the wherewithal or experience with the technology. The technology may be fine, but they really aren't familiar with it, to some of Craig's points earlier about understanding the feedstock aspects. That's getting there, I think. And I'm sure that we could go on for a long time about just teasing out some of the things I just said, and there are lots of different views of different folks on how to manage, the ups and downs, but I think those are some of the key elements there. Then once you get to financing and you have it in place, it really does boil down to, will the revenues be there? And that, to me, is more often not the issue on a lot of these types of projects. Afterward is, and it derives from some of those fundamental elements, but clearly whether or not you can generate the gas to meet the model, and that has a lot to do with how you structure your deal, what type of capital you have coming in, and what the terms of those are. So I would then, as part of that, John, that comes sort of back to things that the three of y'all are all intimately familiar with, but clearly things dealing with permitting, all the different types of issues that arise now, and some of the things that are occurring not only. As we all know, here in Virginia, there are potential changes coming down the pike and permitting, and how do we plan for some of these developments as they occur? And so I would, ask you, what do you see as these, not only here in Virginia, but generally speaking, what are those permitting obstacles?
Well, John, I can start. So I say that the biggest timeline obstacle, sort of critical path element, and this is assuming that you've got your life cycle if you're chasing RINs and LCFS, and that you've gotten your pathways approved and your project registered and you're or otherwise be ready to generate, then it's, the biggest permit is going to be your air permit, which always takes can always take a while to get and can have the more complicated, regulatory dealings with it. But that in and of itself is really a process and timing. It's not so much in the typical world that you wouldn't get one. It just would take 9 months, a year, depending on the state and the level of expertise that you bring into it with a good consultant who's good at getting putting together the information the agencies want to have complete applications so that your application will proceed merrily along and not have a whole lot of back and forth that can suck up time. But it added to that now is increasingly something that's going to play into effect, and we'll have to make sure that it's included and thought about in the permitting process is your siting facilities is environmental justice, and I think that's what you may have been alluding to, Doug, with some of the statutory changes in Virginia now. But a lot of times, if you're out in a rural farm area, then you may end up with an environmental justice community within the permitting, the radius of either a financially disadvantaged community or a minority community, and there's recognition now that you need to sort of step back even further when you're permitting projects and think about what are the impacts to an environmental justice community, and are the impacts disproportionate? What can we do to sort of level that out? And that, I think, is going to become a big part of permitting for some of these projects.
Yeah, John, this is Stuart. Yeah, I was going to say, I agree with you, John. I mean, most of these projects, there is an air permit of some level, or whatnot, but also permits that govern the farms, which are typically non-discharge permits, which should be easily permittable. But they do, state by state, they do take longer than others or shorter than others. And what you just outlined are some things that are definitely things that need to be considered. We talked earlier about the earlier kind of concepts where we had microturbines and new emission sources, on farms or near farms, which had to be permitted as such. The interesting thing about these projects, which sometimes gets lost in the narrative, the ones that we're talking about now, RNG on farms and putting it into pipelines, we're actually taking fugitive emissions out of communities. There's not a new emission source like a generator or a turbine or something somewhere. We're actually taking fugitive emissions, business as usual, that are not regulated and not otherwise impacted in different communities, and taking them out and putting them into a usable form where they're going into a pipeline. And the quality of the gas is quite good, and Craig can talk about the science of that, but it is good, really actually very good coming off the digester to begin with. So very little refinement, and so it should be a good story. Although some of the art here is actually having to deal with that on a policy level where people are opposed to it in some communities. So, I'll stop there, but that's definitely the biggest barrier.
Well, that's a good point about the notion. I think of, you think of renewable natural gas and think that everyone would be for it, and I think that there's now more, some folks and some policy issues where people are not as happy about renewable natural gas. We're saying, no, it's still a greenhouse gas. We want everything to be wind or solar, and that can tie both into, some NIMBYism, because with the permits we didn't talk about, or whether you would need, and sometimes you need zoning permits to do these sorts of projects. Sometimes you don't, depending on where the project's located, whether it can fit under a right to farm law where you don't really have other land use approvals. But these projects will sometimes, I think more and more so, may draw opposition that didn't used to come. I don't know, Stuart, if you've seen that pop up.
Yeah, definitely. And it depends, again, it's kind of state by state and region by region, but in my view, there's no question there's a shift here, and it kind of reminds me going back, not that long ago when coal and coal-fired energy was and is, I guess, public enemy number one. Natural gas was a favored bridge fuel, and all was good. And you could see a shift in the environmental community away and to demonize natural gas as a fossil fuel. And you can debate the merits of that, but you see the same sort of, in my view, seeing the same sort of pattern forming here. Where just a few years ago, most every environmental group you could speak to and saw biomass as part of the solution. I mean, you just do a Google search and you can look and see virtually every major group talked about biomass from fields and forests and garbage and sewage and animal manure. All part of the a renewable fuel option for many parts of the U.S. But you see a shift here where the main criticism in some of the environmental groups now of this is a renewable fuel, and they're and they're doing some mental gymnastics to get there. It's they're quibbling about whether it's enough to replace fossil gas, which it's not. It's too expensive, which is interesting because you can, when has that really been a deterrent in some circles? And then it, you have to have pipelines to transport it. So, and pipeline seems to be a bad word these days. So it's a growing opposition in many circles, and I think that for normal people, whenever you talk to them, it's you kind of scratch your head about that, but you can see it happening. So to the extent that it's going to get to the same point where fossil fuels are been demonized, I doubt, but that seems to where it's going right now.
Yeah, and then I guess you also have sort of like in California, which wants to electrify everything by, I think, 2050, that there are sort of policy provisions back and forth that change as to whether it's favored, not favored.
Yeah. I mean, some states are are more, I don't know if extreme or not. Like some states want to ban internal combustion engines here in the near or not so near future. But there are lots of less disruptive measures, that provide for huge improvements like these projects are one. But I think Lcfs policies to provide transportation decarbonization, for example, like renewable diesel and things like that, are made from animal feedstocks. Those are real solutions to things, but you are seeing a lot of policy, differences across the country, and depending on the state you're in.
And it'll be interesting to see for the renewable fuel standard, the obligated volume hasn't been set for this year yet. It's usually set, and it's supposed to by statute be set November 30th before the year will be set, but they always miss it and come in and set it late. So I think that it'll be interesting to see what the Biden administration does when it sets the 2021 obligations, is kind of what sort of signals they show. Doug, one thing we haven't talked about yet that I think maybe worth exploring a little bit is to just sort of run through kind of real quick what some of the key agreements are that show up in your typical R&D project. And so I know that.
Yeah.
And I don't know, maybe we could start there with you or Craig and Stuart, and we've heard talk about manure supply agreement and easement agreements. Yeah. But you're putting together the package of what are like the 6 key contracts that really go to make these things work.
Sure. So I think first, and I'll just mention a couple. Your feedstock, in our case, manure supply agreements, feedstock agreements, whatever your feedstock is important, and obviously it needs to be locked up for a period of time, particularly if you haven't, trying to attract investors. But that farmer interaction and that feedstock or manure supply agreement is critical. along with, depending on where you're at with financing, gas sales agreements, if you have to lock that up for some period of time and not going to be on the spot Lcfs and RIN market. Stuart.
Yeah, no, I mean, there are, obviously a number of agreements that I don't know if this is the most complicated of all kind of transactions, but there are a number of things that firms have to help us with. I mean, in terms of the business entity, like we talked about our joint venture, that's one. But operating agreements, service agreements, the EPC, easements are another issue. I mean, unlike a utility, we don't have eminent domain. So easement agreements and the ability to use existing easements and even state-owned easement areas are all things that have gone into the things that we're working on now. Interconnect agreements and offtakes. I mean, that's a whole laundry list of things. But and I probably missed some or didn't include them in the list off the top of my head. But those come to mind.
Well, and on the offtake side, John, just on the offtake side there, where Stuart was mentioning, do you want to talk about some of the different forms of environmental attribute agreements, that are out there, or the way the commodity is sold, and the different ways that can happen, and maybe that gets into how the RIN in some of these deals, the RIN is created or split off, and the different buyers there, perhaps.
Sure. So there's going to be some kind of, if you're trying to sell RINs or Lcfs, there'll be an environmental attributes agreement if you unbundle your gas from your environmental attributes, so that on one hand you'll have a gas sales agreement potentially that's just straight up gas, and then with another party you could have an environmental attributes agreements to sell any RINs or Lcfs created by the use of the gas to a contractual arrangement with yet another third party, maybe a fleet party that's going to use the fuel. And so you could end up with sort of three agreements that all work together to create a RIN or a marketable credit. And one of the key things about that, from the point of view of the person who wants to sell that credit, is to make sure that you've got to then later on and have the rights to get the transportation use, for instance, verified of the renewable fuel. So that's one of the key contractual provisions, is that you have the right to go audit or get the reports that are needed to be done for the person that's going to support your credit creation. So those are, and there's some straight up forms that are used. The LEAP form comes to mind. NASB has environmental attribute forms. So there are plenty of contractual forms out there about that. But that reminds me, one question I was going to ask about the Q RINs is to Stuart and Craig, is when you all do generate RINs, do you just sell RINs straight up, or do you try to generate Q RINs, and have you noticed anyone asking for them?
We just generate RINs straight up. We use a marketing service. Element Market has done a fantastic job for us, and they market those attributes and provide us guidance on how best to do so.
Yeah, that's a good point too. That's worth mentioning. Is there are entities out there that act as brokers and can come in and sort of package this up together and say, we know someone who needs to buy the RINs. We know people who want to use the gas as fuel, and we know people who will buy the gas as well, and can kind of come help put together a package to take care of all the elements.
Yep, that works best for us generally.
Well, do y'all, and as you work through those agreements, are there any hot button issues that consistently arise? Stuart or Craig or John, certainly I see it on the financing documents, or from the financing angle, but when you're putting those together, I mean, and I guess it could be anything from, whether they're, force majeure provisions or change in law provisions or, other aspects that you think are hotly contested.
That's one reason we use the service for that. But I think, one thing for us is, we're dealing with an animal, a biological creature, and we do from time to time have disease issues that crop up. And so making sure in any of these agreements that it's acknowledged that disease would be a reason we couldn't supply the gas from a force majeure standpoint, that we have contracted, is something that's very important to us. So I would imagine no matter what type of project you're developing, you would have something similar that just beyond your control, and you have to make sure that that's acknowledged up front.
And do you see some of that, Craig, ever? I mean, through the insurance. I know that in those aspects, sometimes the insurance. I mean, obviously there are scenarios where businesses that are in agricultural livestock have to make changes to their operations. But what sort of financial assurance do you all ever see delivered in that case to assist with that?
Well, we would be careful, number one, not to obligate ourselves beyond what we think we can reasonably produce, even if we're down, So in terms of a longer-term contract, most of these are sold as they're delivered. So, we produce them, we sell them. In terms of long-term agreements, we would be very careful and have been very careful not to obligate ourselves beyond what we think we can reasonably produce, even given disease pressures, et cetera. So we've not gotten into the point of, we don't want to get into the point and haven't had to yet to guarantee in long-term offtake agreements more than we feel like we can produce. And so we're going to be very careful in that, because we understand we have some risk of delivery, but not based on technology or anything else, but based clearly, just squarely on, there not being animals that are produced manure due to some events beyond our control. So we're not trying to mitigate that risk through any sort of insurance or what have you. Doug, we're managing it through how much we obligate ourselves to.
Okay. Yeah, I'd
say that's the primary thing. The only thing I would say too is, and it kind of even more basic. We've had discussions on the basic terms of the term. These are long-term operations and agreements, longer than, for the most part, most agreements that we as a business would deal with. And the termination provision is hard to, it's hard to imagine, what's going to happen in 5 years or 6 years or 7 years to all this. And so what the considerations you go into what the term has to be and termination provisions are things that we've, obviously had to discuss.
Right.
With and I think we have a bunch of audience questions, so maybe in just a minute we will take a look at those. But I guess, Stuart, there's one last thing I think I wanted to make sure that we did mention, because it comes up a lot, and you were talking about what's going to happen in 5, 6, or 7 years. It sort of made me think about it, which is people talk about on the renewable fuel standard side, the renewable fuel standard, what they call the sunset provision, which is that the Act itself only has mandated amounts set forth until 2022. And some people view that and have worried about that. This has come up as a financing question. Lenders will often ask it first thing is what does that mean? Does that mean the project, that the renewable fuel standard part would go away in 2023? And the answer to that is no, because the way the Act is set up is Congress, there's no longer these mandated amounts set by Congress, but it's still the provision of the Act says, and in the following calendar years, the EPA administrator will set the standards. So while there's no longer, it is possible that standard could go down, I suppose, could go up, but it's not the case that the program goes away. It's just that there's a different person now who will be responsible each year for setting them. And I just wanted to make sure and get that out there because that is a question that comes up a lot.
Yeah.
But Jim, I don't know if you whether we ought to. I think we have about 10 minutes left, and I see there's several questions, or maybe we should start answering some audience questions.
Yeah, that's great. And John, why don't we just go in the order received? And I think any of us, I hope everybody can see these. One question was, are there other programs comparable to LCFS? John, I believe there are. I believe Oregon has one, and I believe several states are in the process of considering them. Do you recall?
I know Washington is considering one. And I know I think Massachusetts may be now considering one. I think there's a fair amount under consideration, but with California it's still being the gold standard, and Oregon coming into play. But that is something that certainly that would increase the markets if those West Coast states get end up all with their own standards.
And are there any how about outside the U.S. Neighbors? Does Canada or Mexico? Are you aware whether there are any in Canada or Mexico?
I don't know about Mexico. I believe Canada has talked about it in certain areas, but I'm frankly not as familiar, to tell you the truth.
Yep. No, understood. The next question is, are there any, in the frame of reference of the Recovery Act after the financial crisis in 07 and 08, when the Recovery Act was put in place in 09, are there similar incentives out there now? Some of these questions I think we'll have to get back to the various question askers on, but there are a bunch of different types of incentives out there for these projects. Now, some of these aren't unique to something like the Recovery Act, and I'm not aware of something right this second, but I will check. We'll check and get back. I don't know if John or Stuart or Craig, you guys are aware of anything comparable to the Recovery Act amounts that were distributed among energy offices and made available for these types of projects that are out there that's being considered right now.
Yeah, it's not something that I'm aware of from Smithfield or our partners, our JVs that we've either looked for, asked for, or are participating in. So I don't know.
Yeah, and if some of these questions come in, we don't know the answers, we'll circle back with folks. The next question maybe this is directed towards you and you, Craig, and Stuart, about blending the RNG into the pipelines. Can you address that?
Well, I'm looking at the one that asked about the threats to the RNG market. Yeah, is that the one you're talking about? Yeah.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. Well, clearly, I think the uses for RNG have evolved, and I think they'll continue to evolve. It's something that we do keep track of in terms of medium heavy transportation vehicles. Are they going to be? Is this going to be moved more towards electrification or hydrogen fuel cells? I would tell you though that if it does, RNG doesn't have to be used directly as a transportation fuel in a compressed natural gas vehicle. You can also take RNG and make electricity out of it, which would be renewable electricity. I was on a call this week with the RNG Coalition, and there's technology that's coming that will allow you to take that methane and split it and actually produce hydrogen for hydrogen fuel cells, renewable hydrogen. And so I think, yes, there's clearly, something you've got to look at, and it's going to evolve over time. But, I think you're producing a very low carbon fuel that's going to have uses in any number of applications. I will say, too, that some of the interest we have for our gas is not necessarily in the transportation market. And so, there are other markets, third-party markets, as Stuart talked about earlier, out there as well.
Right, the voluntary markets.
Yes. Well, in North Carolina, too, as an example, you have the Renewable Energy Portfolio Standard, and, you can sell that gas to satisfy the REC requirements under that law as well.
I think the next question that we started with, oh, sorry, go ahead, Doug.
Yeah, no, John, you go ahead.
Well, I was just going to, I guess, finish off with Craig about the question about, I think we started with, which was, what is the involvement, with the pipeline utilities and things like that to get the gas injected into the pipeline, and how much involvement is there? And I'm sure that's probably changed with you over time, because now with Dominion you have, as you mentioned, someone who's an expert at pipelines. But that is, I think, can be a key part of a project. Is actually, it's one thing to generate it, but you have to get it into the pipeline.
True.
There's a tax incentive question. I think it says the question is availability of state, federal tax incentives for these types of projects. And I would even go one step further and say local. And I think there are a variety of different types of incentives out there. I mean, on the federal level, for a tax incentive for not electricity production for gas, I guess there's that blender's credit. I candidly would have to go look at it. I don't have a lot of experience with that, and I think it may still be in place. But again, we can circle back on that question. I don't know if John, you, or Stuart, or Craig can address that particular credit at all.
I'm sorry, which credit is that?
There's a blender's tax credit, I think, for certain types of cellulosic fuels and biofuels, and
that's not something that the producer of that fuel receives. So I don't have I don't think I can talk intelligently on it.
Yeah, no sweat, and we'll circle back on that. I think it was included in one of the last pieces of legislation a couple of years ago at the end of the year, and I'd have to go look at it. On the state side, there are, depending on the state, obviously, lots of various credits available. I think there's some really good resources out there. The NC State resource is always a great resource for checking on those. And then obviously local, there are also other local incentives that might apply as well. But I would say generally yes to that question.
And Doug's probably was mentioning the other.
I just got a comment from somebody that said the blender credit is for biomass diesel, not RNG. So that somebody just sent in that comment. So to clarify, I appreciate that. Go ahead, John.
No, I was just going to say, in talking about answering some of the questions about the policy and the credits, it is for, I think Craig alluded to it, but there's the Renewable Coalition for Renewable Gas that we're members of, and other industry groups that have a fair amount of information about some of the things that go along with biogas and renewable natural gas that are useful sources.
Well, we are at the top of the hour, and I believe we have hit our limit. And as a result, I just wanted to pause here for a moment to say we do have a number of questions from folks that we will circle back on with those individuals, and more importantly, on behalf of this group, Stuart and Craig and John, we just want to thank everybody for joining, listening, and participating. And we certainly hope you found this useful, and don't hesitate to follow up with any of the people here with any questions afterward. And we hope everyone has a wonderful day.
Great talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks.